When nothing applauds, you still move. There is a form of discipline that survives after praise disappears. It unsettles people. Because nothing is being chased anymore. Most men believe discipline lives on rewards, progress, validation, a visible return. When those disappear, their hands slow, their posture loosens, their routine begins to ask questions. The room feels colder. The lungs hesitate before the next breath. Fingers hover instead of closing around the tool. That hesitation is where most identities quietly dissolve. You've seen the pattern. It may already be yours. Strong beginnings. Clean first weeks. Someone notices. A comment lands. Energy rises. Then silence. No feedback. No signal. The body still wakes early, but the reason is gone. Shoulders tighten. The floor feels harder under bare feet. And suddenly the habit needs encouragement it was never meant to require. Ancient warriors understood this failure long before modern language tried to decorate it. In old training halls, no one clapped. No one tracked streaks. The work continued because stopping would feel stranger than continuing. The body learned the hour. The hands repeated the motion. The mind arrived late, if at all. Identity carried what motivation could not. There is a quiet moment when reward leaves and something else takes its place. Not pride. Not strength. A colder mechanism. One that does not ask how it feels today. One that keeps moving even when no one is watching, especially then. Before you continue, name the habit you abandoned the moment it stopped paying you back. Do not explain it. Just name it. The hour that arrives without permission. The hour arrives whether you respect it or not. The room is dim. Cold air presses into the lungs. The floor pulls heat from the soles of your feet. You move anyway. No announcement. No countdown. Hands reach for the same place they always do. The body recognizes the sequence before the mind finishes complaining, and that delay matters. At first, the absence of reward feels like an insult. No message lights the screen. No one asks how it went. The shoulders tense as if waiting for impact that never comes. You tie the belt the same way. The knot sits where it always sits. Outside, nothing changes. Inside, something tightens, not resolve, but friction. This is where most routines collapse. Not from pain, but from quiet. The body starts to feel heavier without witnesses. Fingers stiffen. The mouth dries. The pulse takes longer to steady. You notice the clock more than the task. Someone nearby yawns, checks their phone, leaves the room. Social gravity pulls away, and with it goes the borrowed energy you didn't know you were using. You continue. Not cleanly. Not heroically. Knees bend onto the mat without ceremony. The fabric scratches the skin. Breath counts return only after wandering. Each repetition is dull, uncelebrated. The work sounds louder in the silence, wood on wood, cloth against skin, breath against teeth. No one looks up. That indifference sharpens the edge. A memory intrudes, how it felt when this earned something. The chest loosens at the thought. The next movement hesitates. You feel it immediately, an almost imperceptible pause where a decision tries to form. The pause is dangerous. It invites negotiation. It asks what this is for. The answer does not arrive, and you move anyway, because the sequence has already begun. Others pass through the space. They glance once. One smirks. Another asks if you're still doing this. The question hangs in the air like dust. Your jaw tightens. Heat gathers behind the eyes. You do not answer. Answering would turn it into a performance. Silence keeps it private, and privacy removes the need to justify. Minutes stack without ceremony. Sweat cools on the back of the neck. Shoulders ache in a familiar, unremarkable way. This ache is not a signal, it's a texture. The mind tries again, suggests adjusting, skipping, saving it for later. The body does not reply. Hands wrap the handle the same way. Feet return to the same marks. The repetition is not discipline yet. It is inertia forming. When the hour ends, nothing marks it. No relief. No surge. You wipe your hands. The room looks unchanged. That is the point. You leave without closure, carrying a thin, unsettled feeling. Something did not pay you back, and you stayed. The absence lingers, asking whether this can continue tomorrow without explanation, when effort stops asking for meaning. The second week feels different. The novelty is gone. The body still wakes, but without urgency. The air is the same temperature. The light hits the same corner of the room. Nothing signals importance anymore. You sit, stand, or begin without ceremony. The movement feels flatter. That flatness is new. This is where effort usually demands meaning. The shoulders tighten as if bracing for an explanation that never comes. Breath feels shallow at first. The chest expands only after a few cycles. The hands repeat the motion, but the grip is duller, less charged. Someone watching would say you look calm. Inside, there is a low irritation with no clear target. The mind tests questions quietly. What is this building toward? Why now? Why still? Each question lands and slides off without answer. The silence does not respond. It simply remains. You notice how often you used results to end discomfort. Without them, the discomfort stays longer. The legs ache earlier. The neck stiffens sooner. Sweat appears with no promise attached. Around you, life moves normally. Someone laughs down the hall. A door closes. A message comes through on a phone you don't check. Social time continues without you. That absence registers in the body as pressure behind the ribs. The urge to rejoin it flickers, then fades when you don't move. You keep going. The repetition strips drama from the action. Knees fold. Arms rise. Feet adjust. Breath counts slip, return, slip again. There is no surge to carry you. Each movement requires a small, unglamorous agreement with the next one. Not motivation. Compliance. The body complies because it already started. At some point, the work stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like weather. It is simply present. You don't praise the rain for falling. You don't resent it either. You notice how the skin reacts. How the temperature settles. How resistance changes texture when it no longer argues. Someone eventually asks why you're still doing this if nothing comes of it. The question lands harder than expected. Jaw tightens. The stomach pulls inward. You feel exposed, not because you lack an answer, but because answering would shrink it into something understandable. You say very little. The conversation moves on. The work remains. By the end, there is still no reward. No relief. No sense of completion. Just a steady fatigue and a body that followed through without being convinced. You leave with that same thin feeling, but it has shifted. It is less sharp now. More neutral. Less demanding. Something is learning how to continue without needing to know why. And that learning is not finished, the quiet negotiation that always returns. It never announces itself. It arrives as a slight delay between movements. A pause where breath hangs a fraction too long. The shoulders lift, then wait. The negotiation does not sound like resistance. It sounds reasonable. You feel it mid-motion. Muscles already warm. Sweat tracing down the spine. The body is working, but the mind leans in with conditions. Just today, it suggests. You've already shown up. That should count for something. The suggestion tightens the throat. The next repetition slows. This is where many routines fracture, not loudly, but politely. The environment offers help. A chair nearby. A surface to lean on. A reason to adjust. Someone passing glances over and asks if you're almost done. Their tone is neutral. Your chest tightens anyway. The question reframes the hour as optional. You feel the pull to agree, to shorten it, to convert endurance into efficiency. The belt feels heavier around the waist. You continue, but now every movement is watched internally. Breath feels thicker. The jaw sets. The body senses scrutiny and stiffens under it. This is the cost of letting the mind sit too close to the work. It starts to manage instead of follow. Each action now needs approval, and approval is slow. The negotiation grows smarter over time. It remembers past rewards. It compares days. It offers compromises that sound mature. Reduce the volume. Save energy. Be strategic. You feel these suggestions as a pressure behind the eyes, a faint headache forming where attention tightens. The hands hesitate on the handle. Skin slick with sweat shifts its grip. You answer none of it. Not because you are strong, but because the answer would extend the conversation. Instead, you lower intensity without stopping. Movements become smaller. Slower. Knees still fold to the mat. Arms still rise. Breath shortens, steadies. The body accepts continuity even when performance drops. This adjustment happens without comment. Someone nearby laughs at something unrelated. The sound irritates you more than it should. It highlights the difference between motion and stillness, between those moving through the day and you repeating something that leads nowhere obvious. The irritation passes when you don't follow it. By the end, the negotiation is tired. Not defeated, just unanswered. The body hums with a low ache. Shoulders sag slightly. Fingers feel swollen and clumsy. You clean up in silence. No sense of victory follows you out. Only a quiet observation, the negotiation returned, and you did not resolve it. It will come back tomorrow. The question is whether the body will already be moving when it does. The body learns what the mind resists. There is a point where the body begins before the thought arrives. It is subtle. You notice it when your feet touch the floor without checking the temperature. When the hands reach forward before the chest tightens. The order has shifted, slightly, and that shift matters. The room feels the same. The air still cool. The light still indifferent. But the body no longer waits for permission. Muscles engage without ceremony. The spine settles into position. Breath finds a rhythm that does not need counting. The mind lags behind, arriving late with its usual inventory of doubts, and finding the work already underway. This is not ease. The shoulders still ache. The neck holds tension. The skin prickles with sweat cooling too quickly. But the ache no longer argues. It has been reclassified, from obstacle to background. Like the hum of a distant machine. Present, but no longer central. Someone nearby comments that you're consistent. The word lands awkwardly. It feels inaccurate, almost misleading. Consistency implies effort, pride, intention. What you feel instead is inevitability. Not showing up would now require a reason. That realization tightens the chest more than praise ever did. The body responds to this new arrangement quietly. Movements grow economical. Excess fades. You stop adjusting what doesn't need adjusting. Knees lower at the same angle. Hands settle faster. Breath deepens later, not sooner. There is less checking, less correcting. The work looks plainer from the outside. Inside, it feels heavier, denser. Without reward, time stretches differently. Minutes lose their edges. You can't tell how long you've been at it without looking. The mind attempts to mark progress, fails, and withdraws. In that withdrawal, something else fills the space, not focus, not calm, but continuity. Social friction sharpens here. Others begin to predict you. They stop asking. Invitations shift around your schedule without discussion. Someone jokes that you're rigid. The word scrapes. Heat flashes briefly behind the eyes. You say nothing. The routine holds. Their discomfort confirms something you do not name. Toward the end, fatigue settles into the joints. Fingers feel thick. Shoulders sink. The body moves slower but does not stop. This slowness is not mercy. It is calibration. Intensity fades, presence remains. You finish without ceremony, as always. Later, when the mind reviews the session, it finds no highlight to store. No moment to replay. That absence feels strange, almost disappointing. Then it passes. The body already knows when it will return. The mind can follow or not. Tomorrow will not feel special either. And that is beginning to feel important. Continuity survives what pride cannot. Injury, fatigue, disruption, this is where pride usually makes its stand. The body sends signals early now. A dull ache behind the knee. Tightness crawling up the forearm. The warning signs arrive without drama, but they are precise. The room is unchanged. The hour is unchanged. What shifts is capacity. This is where people disappear. They mistake adjustment for failure. They believe stopping clean is better than continuing imperfectly. You feel that impulse as a pressure to protect the image you once had of the work. The image asks for rest. The body asks for movement. The conflict settles into the joints. You lower the pace without announcing it. Movements shorten. Range reduces. The mat feels colder today. Knees take longer to settle. Breath feels uneven, as if the lungs are negotiating their own terms. You allow it. Continuity does not require intensity. It requires presence. Someone notices the change. They ask if you're hurt. The question lands sharp. Heat rises in the face. The urge to explain surfaces immediately, to frame this as strategic, temporary, justified. You swallow it. Explaining would turn continuity into a defense. You nod once and continue at the reduced pace. The nod ends the conversation. The body responds with a different kind of fatigue. Not the burning kind. The dense kind. Muscles feel full, heavy, less responsive. Fingers fumble briefly. The grip slips, then resets. Each repetition costs more attention now. That cost is paid without complaint, because complaint would require belief in an alternative. The mind attempts a familiar trap. If you can't do it properly, wait until you can. The suggestion feels reasonable. Sensible. You feel it as a softening behind the sternum, an invitation to be careful. Carefulness, here, would be a break. You continue smaller instead. Slower. The chain remains unbroken. Outside the room, life moves efficiently. Someone finishes early. Someone skips entirely. You hear about it later. Their stories carry relief. Yours carries nothing. When asked how it went, you say very little. There is nothing to report. That absence of narrative feels heavier than soreness. By the end, the body is tired but intact. The ache settles into a low throb that promises to linger. You clean up slowly. Movements feel deliberate, weighted. No satisfaction arrives. No disappointment either. Just the fact of continuation. This is where continuity begins to outgrow pride. Pride wants the work to look a certain way. Continuity only wants it to exist. One survives disruption. The other does not. Tomorrow will bring another limitation. The body will adjust again, when routine becomes socially inconvenient. The change is not announced. It appears in other people first. You notice it when plans are made without checking with you. When times are shifted slightly, quietly, to work around what you no longer explain. The body feels it as a subtle tension across the upper back. Not anger. Not pride. A pressure from being accounted for without being consulted. Your routine continues. Same hour. Same preparation. The floor still pulls heat from the feet. The air still dries the mouth in the first minutes. Hands move automatically now. The sequence no longer asks how the day went. It does not care who noticed yesterday. Someone comments that you're predictable. They smile when they say it, as if offering a compliment. The word lands like weight in the stomach. Predictable is safe. Predictable is boring. Predictable is inflexible. You feel the pull to soften, to show range, to reassure them you're still adjustable. The urge tightens the jaw. You do not change anything. The work has lost its drama entirely. There is no spike of resistance at the beginning. No relief at the end. Breath settles late and stays there. Sweat forms evenly, without urgency. Muscles engage with minimal signal. It feels mechanical, but not dead. More like a door that opens because it always opens. Social friction increases as the internal friction disappears. Someone jokes that you're too serious. Another asks if you ever relax. The questions come casually, but they cluster. Each one carries the same implication: this should cost you more visibly. You feel a faint heat behind the eyes, then nothing. Answering would turn it into a defense. Silence lets it remain what it is. You begin to sense how much of your earlier effort was performance. How often reward came disguised as recognition. Without it, the work has narrowed. It fits closer to the bone. The body responds by conserving movement. Less wasted energy. Fewer adjustments. The repetition sharpens, not outwardly, but inwardly. There are moments of emptiness now. Mid-session, a hollow feeling opens in the chest. Not boredom. Absence. No anticipation. No dread. Just space where expectation used to sit. The body continues through it. Knees fold. Arms rise. Breath moves in and out of that hollow without filling it. Later, when someone asks what you're training for, you feel the pause stretch. There is no answer that fits. Saying nothing would sound defensive. Saying anything else would be untrue. You shrug slightly. The conversation shifts. You are left with the quiet after, which feels heavier than the question. This is the cost of continuing without reward. Not exhaustion. Not sacrifice. But becoming less legible to others. Tomorrow will arrive the same way. The routine will meet it without explanation, the point where stopping feels stranger. One morning, the body moves before you notice it. Feet touch the floor. Weight shifts forward. Hands reach. There is no internal signal to begin. No agreement is made. The action is already happening. When awareness catches up, it feels late, like entering a room mid-conversation. The sensation is unsettling. Not because it is easy, but because it removes choice. The floor is cold. The air still tightens the lungs at first. Muscles still resist the opening movements. None of that has changed. What has changed is the absence of permission. The work does not wait to be authorized. You register this shift as a faint pressure behind the eyes. A quiet alertness. The mind searches for its usual footholds, reward, reason, recognition, and finds nothing to grip. The body continues anyway. Knees fold. Arms rise. Breath adjusts without instruction. The sequence feels heavier now, not lighter. Heavier because it is no longer fueled by expectation. Stopping enters the picture briefly. Not as temptation, but as an abstract possibility. You imagine not doing this. The image feels wrong in the body, like missing a step in the dark. The stomach tightens. The shoulders lift reflexively. The discomfort surprises you. Continuing has become the path of least resistance. Others sense the change before you name it. They stop asking if you're tired. They stop suggesting alternatives. Someone remarks that you are always there. The word always carries weight. It settles in the chest, not as pride, but as gravity. Being absent would now require explanation. Presence does not. The work itself is plain, almost featureless. No peak moments, no collapse, just sustained motion. Sweat cools evenly across the back. Fingers ache in a familiar, low-grade way. The ache no longer signals anything. It is simply part of the texture, like the sound of breath or the scrape of fabric. Midway through, the hollow returns, the space where reward used to live. It opens without warning. The body moves through it as it would through fog. There is no attempt to fill it. No story forms. That emptiness feels stable now. Less like loss, more like ground. When the hour ends, you notice because the sequence ends, not because you are relieved. You stop where you always stop. Hands lower. Breath slows gradually. The room looks unchanged. That sameness no longer irritates you. It confirms something wordless. Later, when asked why you still do this, the question feels distant. Not offensive. Not confusing. Just irrelevant. The answer would imply a transaction. There is none. The body has already learned the shape of the day. This is the point few reach. Where continuing costs less than stopping. Where reward is no longer missing. Because it is no longer expected, when discipline no longer needs an audience. At some point, the question disappears. Not because it was answered, but because it stopped mattering. The body wakes and moves without checking the ledger. The floor is cold. The lungs tighten once, then open. Muscles complain briefly, then cooperate. There is no sense of sacrifice in it anymore. No feeling of virtue. The work happens the way breathing happens, noticeable only if interrupted. This is where discipline stops being an action. It becomes a condition. You are not staying consistent. You are simply intact. The hour exists. You exist inside it. Nothing needs to be negotiated. Without reward, the noise thins out. The mind loses leverage. It cannot bargain with what no longer listens. The body has already accepted the rhythm. Stopping would now require justification. Continuing does not. Others may still misunderstand this. They may call it rigid, excessive, unnecessary. You feel those words land as pressure in the chest, then pass. Their confusion no longer reaches the hands. The sequence holds. This is the quiet edge where identity finishes forming. Not announced. Not celebrated. Just lived. Discipline is no longer something you use to get somewhere else. It is where you stand. If this exposed something uncomfortable in you, mark it publicly. One sentence. No explanation. Name the action you will continue even when nothing comes back.